Hi, PGWE students. Sorry for the technical difficulties this morning. What I'll do right now is I'll record the ending of the species concept and speciation lecture, and then I'll record another one on phylogenetics, and we'll be doing some problems in class on Thursday and have a chance for a review session for the second exam, which will be a week from today. So the last thing we finished up on was that we were talking about how barriers often lead barriers between an original population, separating populations into two subpopulations, can over time lead to divergence. And a lot of this could be adaptation to different environments. The monkey flowers were an example of that. But oftentimes what happens is this barrier is temporary or ephemeral. Excuse me, the barrier can disappear potentially before the speciation is complete, where the total reproductive isolation has occurred between these two subpopulations. So oftentimes what we're going to talk about next, and this can occur at various different kinds of scales, and this can occur where two allopatric populations, the barrier disappears and they can come back into contact. You can also have the case of parapatric speciation, where the two subpopulations join at an edge. And even a bigger problem is, of course, where you can have sort of sympatric speciation. The example of the cichlids would be a case where that would be a case of sympatric speciation, where these color variants of the males diverged depending on whether you were near the surface of the lake or at the bottom of the lake, and various kinds of coloration was favored because females often preferred those kinds of males. So this barrier and this where these two populations can potentially intermix and mate is a thing we're going to talk about now. So oftentimes when the barrier disappears before speciation is complete, what can happen sometimes is you can get what are called matings between the two species, and we call these hybrid matings. Now, there are a lot of outcomes when there are hybrid matings between these two subpopulations. The outcomes are the hybrids between these, that is, interspecific matings, the hybrids can have relatively low fitness. In this particular case, what happens is because those hybrids have low fitness, selection acts against mating with members of the other species, and you get what's called a secondary reinforcement, such that it completes the speciation process. So selection acts against mating with other individuals of another species, or disassortative mating, and selection favors mating with your own species because your offspring will have higher fitness than the hybrids. So that sort of process where the hybrids have low relative fitness, even though they potentially mate for a while, the process over time it actually can complete the process, and you get this continued divergence between the two populations and ultimately speciation. Now, the other option is that hybrids pretty much have equal fitness compared to matings between members of the same subpopulations, and there you're not going to, basically they're not different species, and the speciation process is not going to be completed and you won't have it. The other possibility is hybrids in this area of between the two species can often have relatively high fitness, and we'll show you an example of that, and that's called the bounded superiority model. And in fact, there are lots of instances where hybrids seem to have a real distinct fitness advantage in particular kinds of environments, but don't do too well in other environments, and we'll show you an example of this. Okay, so this is outlined in your book pretty well in a box, and I'm not going to go into all the details, and I don't fully understand a lot of the details that have occurred, but these are some snails that occur in Japan. There are two closely related species, Largiolarta and Eucosmia. And what's shown here is in orange is the distribution of this particular species, and in blue is the distribution of this species. So you can see there are some populations, say around Bonoko, that are only found this one particular species. In Kura, there's this other species. So these are areas that are considered sort of the allopatric populations, and they're different from here. But there's this whole area right in here going all along, basically running down this island, where you're getting, especially right in here, where you're getting overlap between the two species. And so this is where hybridization can occur, and this is the area of sympatry between these two putative or supposed species, okay? So what we can look at, and this is what I don't understand, what they were looking at, what they said what happened in these hybrid zones, or these areas of sympatry, is a particular trait, penis length, in obviously male snails, are very different between the two populations. So Largiolarta right in here in this area of sympatry has a much longer penis, whereas in this other area in sympatry, the other species has a much smaller penis. And you can kind of see in the areas of allopatry, so Banta, Bacuria, all these other species where the blue one is, right? This is outside the sympatric hybrid zone. They basically are kind of similar to this penis length of the other species. So the key point here, probably what happened in this area where these two species were hybridizing, these hybrids probably had relatively low fitness, and it led to matings and changes in the character of penis length to reduce those interspecific hybrid matings. And so there was strong divergence in this particular trait in this area of the hybrid zone. And the basic take-home message is if you had this sort of thing where these characters become very different between the species in sympatry, that's called reproductive character displacement. And that is a classic example of sort of speciation being completed when hybrids have low fitness. Now, there are lots of other kinds of things that keep individuals of different species from mating with one another, and Dobzhansky was a famous evolutionary biologist who developed the whole series of reproductive isolating mechanisms. A lot of these isolating mechanisms can occur before zygotes are formed, so that there can be matings, but the isolation occurs before the zygotes are formed. And a lot of times there are post-zygotic isolating mechanisms. That's when two species have mated and hybrid produces zygote. You can get fairly low fitness. So zygote dies early in embryogenesis. The F1 hybrids are inviable. The F1 hybrids survive but are sterile. And all these back crosses are inviable. So this would be a case where two species are hybridizing, but there would be very strong selection against these interspecific matings and strong selection against hybrid matings, and should result in eventual speciation. There are also obviously a lot of things that occur in prezygotic isolating mechanisms where potential mates of different species can live in the same place but do not encounter one another due to a bunch of different reasons. They can live in different habitats within the same geographic area, or they're temporally isolated by time, so they're active at different times of the day or different times of the year. Another possibility is these mates of different species can potentially interact, but they don't mate because they're behaviorally isolated. They basically are around one another, but they don't respond, especially to male signals and that sort of thing, and don't mate with the other species. And that's what we would call behavioral isolation. So there are a whole series of these different kinds of isolating mechanisms that allow us to sort of recognize unique species under the biological species concept. One of the classic examples of this has to do with how, especially in plant pollinator interactions, where there are specific traits in the plants that are used to attract pollinators that really distinguish the species. And this is a particular species, Aguilegia. I can't remember the exact common name of it, but obviously you can see they have a very interesting flower morphology, and they have different kinds of pollinators. And the trait that we're interested in is the spur length in these species. And what you can see, these in the blue, and often there's a color difference between the two. Often bumblebee plants are often blue, and hummingbird pollinated plants are primarily red, and moth pollinated plants, especially if they're pollinated at night, tend to be whitish. Okay, so not only is there color variation that are associated with these different pollinators and isolate all these species, but also the length of these spurs. So the pollinator has to come in here, get down in there, and basically get the nectar out of here. The nectar is down in here, and the hawk moth pollinator has to put its proboscis, which is right in here, and it's extremely long, all through this tube down to the bottom, or actually, sorry, it comes up here. That's where the pollen is. Goes all the way down in there, and then obviously gets some pollen on its head, but as it's trying to get the nectar down at the bottom of here, it has to use its proboscis to get way down in there. Okay. So one of the things that's noticed here as you look at the spur length in these various species is associated with a specific kind of pollinator. Bees, for example, the spurs of the flowers are relatively short, and there's some overlap here. You occasionally have hummingbirds, which are characterized by this kind of typical red flower, often have spur lengths around 20 millimeters. On average, the bumblebees are slightly less than 10. And then you have these hawk moths. Some of them have extremely long proboscis, but they tend to be, these hawk moths have these very long floral lengths. The basic idea here is these different kinds of floral morphologies allow particular pollinator species to pollinate them and prevent others from pollinating them, and thus leads to reproductive isolation of these various species. So it's not only the spur length and the flower length is tube length, but also coloration is an important thing that has led to the divergence in all this particular genus of flowers. Okay, the last thing we'll talk about in terms of speciation concepts is what happens in areas where two putative species come together in kind of an intermediate area and potentially hybridize. And this is an example from western sagebrush, which is a fairly common plant in the western United States. It lives in a wide range of environments from down on the basin floor to high up in the mountains. And it's often at mid-elevations between the basin and the mountain zone where these two species, we'll just call this the mountain sagebrush and the basin sagebrush. So this is much drier environments. These are much colder environments. In these mid-elevation areas, you often have this area where these basin and mountain species come together and there's the potential for hybridization. So let's look at, and your book actually has a much better thing. This is sort of germination and early survival, so we can think of this as a measure of fitness. And what they did is they grew in each of these environments, in the basin environment, in these mid-elevation hybrid zone areas, in the mountain environments, individuals from each one of these species. Okay, so let's look at what happens when they grew basin, hybrid, and mountain seeds, and germinate, obviously, in the basin environment. Which one had the highest fitness? Well, basin seeds had much higher fitness than the hybrid seeds and much, much higher than the mountain seeds. So again, this is an example of what we would call local adaptation. That basin seed does best in its local environment, the one it's accustomed to and has evolved in, and natural selection obviously favors germination and early survival in that sort of drier environment. You go to the other extreme, and obviously you see the germination early survival is a little bit lower, but in general you also see the case here that fumbling all over that one because this is really quite odd and it's very different from your book. So we're going to ignore this because your book shows very clearly, given other characteristics, that in fact the mountain seeds do best in their mountain environment. And you can go back and look at your book, but these particular traits don't really show local adaptation, and that's why I fumbled all over it. But in your book, well, you'll see another graph that in fact shows mountain seeds do best in their mountain environment, hybrids do kind of in between, and the basins do very, very poorly. So this is kind of wrong. But what we're really interested in is what happens in this hybrid zone where these two species are potentially mating with one another. And what this shows is, and this is right, that the hybrid individuals actually have the highest germination and early survival in the hybrid zone. Okay, much higher than the parental species. And so what this says is the hybrid seeds do better than others in the hybrid zone, and it's very possible, and what has been shown further is that in fact this might be a new hybrid species being formed at these mid-elevations. So oftentimes hybridization doesn't result in the speciation being completed or speciation being denied, but in fact what it can lead to is the formation of new species, often in these hybrid zones and in these unique environments where you find hybrids. Okay, so this is kind of the example of where you have a hybrid zone, hybrid superiority, and this can lead to potentially even an additional species. Okay, so that'll do it for species concepts and speciation, and next I'll move on to phylogenetics.